All right, it's 2 o'clock, so I guess we'll go ahead and get started.
Okay, we're good.
I'll go ahead and start by introducing myself. My name is Tom Davis. I'm the state senator for District 46, South Carolina Senate. That covers portions of Beaufort and Jasper counties. I'm joined today by a distinguished panel, including Michael Corp, who is the Deputy Director for the SBA South Carolina District Office, Fred Green, who is the President and CEO of the South Carolina Bankers Association, Rashley, who is Senior Vice President for the South Carolina Bankers Association, and also by Dr. Stephen Gilbert, who is the Research Director for the South Carolina Banking and Insurance Committee. And the reason for this particular webinar is to go into some greater detail in regard to one of the aspects of the CARES Act. As you'll recall, that was a COVID-19 response action passed by Congress almost 3 weeks ago now, end of March, that had various components to it, various relief components to it. It provided, in general figures, $250 billion in direct payments to individuals, $260 billion in enhanced unemployment insurance benefits, $377 billion in loans that are convertible to forgivable grants to small businesses via the Small Business Administration. It also provided $150 billion in assistance to state governments, $500 billion in loans to larger companies, being 500 or greater in terms of employees, and then $150 billion to hospitals for supplies and equipment. That's just a brief summary of what the CARES Act that was passed 3 weeks ago did. I have been providing, information to my constituents in regard to the direct payments to individuals, also talking about the unemployment insurance enhancements, explaining them. And I've tried to explain as best I could via email the aspects of the small business relief components of the CARES Act, in particular, the Payroll Protection Act, and the EIDL loan programs. And the number of responses and questions that I got back after trying to explain those particular SBA programs prompted me to come up with this webinar, because there's a lot of different questions, some nuances to the questions, and I wanted my constituents and anybody who's tuning in right now to have the benefit of somebody who is in a position of authority at the Small Business Administration for our state, also to two leaders of the South Carolina banking, as you know, access to these particular funds, the PPP funds and the EIDL funds, are via lenders who participate with the SBA. And I also wanted you to have the benefit of somebody who I have a lot of respect for, Dr. Stephen Gilbert, is the Research Director for the South Carolina Senate's Banking and Insurance Committee. So what I did in preparation for this webinar is I asked individuals to submit questions, and I've got over 100 of those questions, and I spent this past weekend sort of summarizing the questions, distilling them down in a way that I think is going to be most useful for people watching. So, guys, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and read questions, and then let's go in this order. We'll have Mr. Corp, take the first shot and an answer, followed by Fred Green, the CEO of the South Carolina Bankers Association, then Neil Rashley, and then finally Dr. Gilbert. And then as soon as everybody is done commenting on a particular question, I'll move to the next question on my list, and we'll get to as many as we possibly can. So it'll kind of be informal like that. If you feel like, after you've answered the question and somebody else is speaking on that topic, if you've thought of something else and you want to jump back in and share an additional thought, feel free to do so. This isn't going to be formal. It's very informal. And that's the way I want to handle it. The first question is this, and a lot of questions center around this theme. Why did Congress allow so many big businesses to get the SBA loans? Citing big businesses like Ritz-Carlton, Steak Shack, Dave & Buster's, et cetera. They are big businesses, and small businesses are the ones that are dying. So I guess the question is this. how many of the applicants for these SBA programs, whether it's PPP or EIDL, what's the average size in terms of number of employees of the recipients, as opposed to those that say have less than 50 employees? And talk a little bit about that, whether or not that definition of small business in terms of 500 employees, or whether or not that's too generous or too expansive in regard to who gets to qualify for these particular programs. And Mr. Corp, go ahead and start with you.
Yes, sir. Okay. Again, this is Mike Corp from the SBA. I'm the Deputy District Director. So the first question, yeah, we've had a lot of calls on that, and generally below 500 employees is considered a small business, and of course that's the way it's written. So then we also have some statistics that just got put out there. I don't know that it actually, the average loan, I believe, is like $200,000, and over 74% of all the loans made were under $150,000. Now there are some of these, these bigger companies mixed in there, and of course there's oversight after, going on with all this happening with all these loans. But if you go to the Treasury site, they just posted that out there a couple days ago, and it has a summary of all the loans and just kind of answers some of these questions and more. Does it answer the big questions where you see some things on TV about who's getting these loans? Probably not, and those would individually be looked at, of course. But in general, when you say over 74% of all the loans were below 150,000, hopefully we're catching some of those mom and pop small businesses in that action.
Fred, has that been your experience as well in terms of the lending industry, the banking industry in South Carolina, in terms of the types of entities that have applied for and received these SBA program loans?
It has, Senator, and thank you again for letting us participate. I'll share some South Carolina statistics on the payroll protection program. So of the 70 banks that operate in South Carolina, I think 67 participated in the program. The ones that didn't were extremely small banks with limited resources. So it was very broad-based participation. Those banks processed through the SBA portal and had approved, before the allocation was depleted, $3.8 billion for South Carolina small businesses, and that represented 23,000 different small businesses. The average in South Carolina was a little below the national average, right at 165,000. And I was trying to back into how you might equate that $165,000 average to number of employees, and I just picked 50,000 annual compensation per year. And if you go through the math on it, it would be an average number of employees at 20. So considerably less than the 500 maximum.
Okay. Neil, do you have anything to add to that?
Senator, just as to the question itself about, Congress allowing anything, they just simply worked off of the definition that had been of small businesses with the SBA for years, as mentioned, the 500 employees or less, and that, this was a program that was put together extremely quickly because of the dramatic effect across the nation. And, they had to make some tweaks to it for definitions to help out many different types of entities. Did they get most of them right? Very possibly. Did they possibly have to make some changes again? Who knows? But the reality is this is a massive program that had to be put together in just a matter of days. So they worked with the basics there and got it out there. But there certainly was no intentional effort to try to focus on larger businesses. It was working on what SBA had been and trying to go forward from there.
Okay. Stephen, anything to add to what Mr. Corp and Fred and Neil have shared?
Yeah, what I read this morning on this issue was that part of that language appeared in one section of the bill and it allowed 500 per location. And the goal of that was the restaurant industry saw that there wasn't going to be a specific carve out for them. And so they saw this as this was an opportunity to get as many restaurants brought in as possible. So some of the big names you're hearing about, Shake Shack, Ruth's Chris, it was partly their intent, but not entirely their intent, to broaden it out so they would capture everybody in that group. I think it was well intentioned, but like Neil said, when you put together $1 trillion bill in a matter of a week or two, you're going to have unintended consequences like that.
I guess a follow-up to that question, and maybe broaching into another one, in terms of the application process, there have been anecdotal instances or anecdotal, stories that have been shared with me that, banks, I guess maybe because they were overwhelmed with the number of applicants, began to restrict themselves and only take applications from organizations with whom they already had an existing relationship, either on a lending basis or a checking or depository basis. Have you all, and I'll go back and start with Mr. Corp as well, have you all noticed that to be the case, that lending institutions or banks will actually give preference to individuals or entities with whom they have an existing relationship? And is that something that is required or not required under the CARES Act?
Okay, yeah, this is Mike again. We had some calls like that overall, but that's delegated down to the banks. They're making the loans. And in the instances where somebody would call us and they were trying to work with, a lot of times you say who you bank with. And if they couldn't get in with that bank, we have a list of lenders. I mean, there's a website there we can do a search on. Most of the constituents probably went there, where you can punch in your zip code and find a list of lenders. And we also have an in-house one with our resource guide and another one that we made up. So we tried to offer as many alternatives as we could if they could not find a lender. And I think we were fairly successful. But that's really as far as it goes with us. And maybe one of the bankers could chime in.
Yeah, I guess what you're saying is perhaps maybe that's something downstream at the banking level. So I will pose that question to Fred and then to Neil. Do you find that your member banks, have they, in terms of having to handle or do triage on the number of applications coming in, do they sort or give preference to applicants with whom they have an existing relationship, or is it just simply a first come, first served, irrespective of any prior existing relationship?
Senator, this is I guess a classic logistical issue. Every new account that a bank opens has to go through a couple of screens, which are federal law. It's called Bank Secrecy Act and Know Your Customer. And that takes a while. You have to pull credit bureaus. You've got to do a number of things to satisfy that requirement. If, however, an applicant in the PPP program was already a bank customer, then the bank could avoid that very time-consuming screen. And so, because of the overwhelming number of applications received by virtually every bank that offered the program, which I said is just about every one, it was the existing customers took a lot less time to process than a non-customer. So I don't think a bank out there had a policy not to accept applications from non-customers. However, they were able to process their existing customers much, much quicker because of these other pre-existing federal laws.
Okay, Neil, anything to add to that, Neil?
Yeah, I mean, Mr. Green is exactly right. I mean, even though the CARES Act did not prioritize, set priorities, or incentivize different types of businesses to get loans, the reality is that these existing regulations and laws that are absolutely required of banks to go through were there, and that put the pressure on banks with a huge volume, as Mr. Green mentioned, how to handle these applications.
Okay. Stephen?
No, I think they're exactly right. You know, they would have financials. They would have a whole folder of information already in hand on these folks that they have an existing relationship with. So, you know, it's intuitive that if they're trying to get in line fast, that they would work most likely with the folks that they already had that paperwork done.
Well, let me go ahead before we leave this topic, you know, and I think I understand what you're saying. And I appreciate the fact that if you've already got information on a particular applicant, things will go much more quickly. You've often heard out there in the media that banks handle this on a first come, first served basis. Can it fairly be said to individuals that banks are not giving preference to somebody, you know, who may pay extra money for a processing fee or may have some ability, access to individuals within a bank? I mean, is it fair to say that banks are doing the best they can on a first come, first served basis, and that the reason some applications are approved more quickly is because the bank already has existing information on certain applicants? Is that a fair summary?
Senator, this is Fred Green. That is a fair summary. We said early on before the first application was accepted by any bank, said that was a preference to go first come, first served. That was not a requirement from SBA. SBA processed the applications as they got them, first come, first served. But from the banking standpoint, it was first come, first served. I want to say for the most part, I wouldn't know a particular bank's policy, but in general, that's what everyone attempted to do. In terms of the comment or the question about an additional processing fee, banks were not allowed to charge a processing fee of 1 penny of any or to any of the PPP applicants.
Okay, that's helpful. Let me do this for a minute. Let me pause for a moment. I think some people are having a hard time coming on the live stream. So hold on just a minute, please. We're gonna pause here and see what we can do to fix this.
Okay, you're back.
Okay, guys, we're back on. I apologize for that. Some people are having a hard time logging on to the live stream. I wanted to work out that technical problem, and I think we're good to go now. Let me ask this practical question of 4 of you, and Mr. Corp. Individuals or organizations that submitted applications to lending institutions for either the PPP loan or the EIDL loan, and before their loans got approved or before they were funded, the notice was received that the SBA had run out of funds. If and when Congress does this supplement that they're now debating, will those applicants have to refile, or will the application that they've already made, do they retain their status, their priority in terms of line, and then the funding just goes on and then they get handled on a first come, first served basis? Or how does that work in regard to individuals who applied but didn't get funded prior to the SBA running out of funds? So, Mr. Corp.
Okay, I'll start off with the SBA disaster loan, the economic injury disaster loan. And I know there's a lot of questions coming up on that too, so I won't get too involved. But actually, those are still being processed as we speak. I've actually had a couple good calls this week where people actually got some of their funding. A lot of people following up. It has been a little bit slow. Of course, we'd like to see it move faster, but that is moving along. So there are still people being awarded dollars to that. Now, if somebody were to go in there today and like they were going to do their application for the first time, it's going to say there are no funds available. So everybody's kind of in a wait mode to see if they get loans allocated against that program right now, or more so even when we get additional funding. So that's kind of in that area. Now, the other side of that, the PPP program, I would say that's probably all where they left off in the process. If they were approved for loans and the funds haven't been distributed yet, and that's a question to ask the banks they're working with, and somebody on the call, of course, the bankers can chime in on that part too.
Okay, Fred, let's move to that. In terms of, so let me wrap up the first part of that, Mr. Corp. In regard to the EIDL aspect of this program, there are funds for that, and the applications for the EIDL, they're still being received, approved, and funded. is just the PPP applications at this point in time for which there are no funds. Is that correct?
The funds did run out for the EIDL, but whatever is being currently processed, in other words, some people didn't get distributed the loan amounts yet. So people that have their applications in may or may not receive funds towards them.
Okay.
They're going in a pecking order.
Okay, let's move now to Fred and to Neil to talk about at the banking level. If you have an applicant that made an application for a PPP loan, and either they were approved but not funded, or they had not yet been approved, if and when Congress supplements the appropriation such that there are additional funds for that payroll protection program, will those applicants need to refile, or will the information that they have submitted be sufficient?
Senator Fred Green, I'll jump in. There is maybe a distinction between approved, where that approval is. So the way the program works is the banks collect the required information and submits it through an SBA portal. If SBA approves that application and determines the loan amount, they issue a number back to the bank. At that point in time, those dollars are counted toward that $350 billion allocation. The bank then knows the loan was approved by SBA, and they will work toward closing on that loan and use their own proceeds. That differs from, I guess, about 10 a.m. This past Thursday, when banks were feverishly trying to get applications processed through the portal, and then it suddenly the dollars or the allocation ran out. We surveyed the banks in South Carolina that are headquartered in South Carolina, and the 49 other states surveyed banks headquartered in their states, so we would have a feel for the dollars and the numbers of applications that had been received by the banks but were not approved by SBA. That number, again, these are just the banks headquartered in South Carolina, but that number was over 4,000 applications and $500 million. Now, the banks are holding those applications, and what we hope is when the bill passes, there are no changes to the process, the procedures, the requirements, the paperwork, and the application itself. And if that is the case, then immediately upon notification that banks can begin processing applications, they will start. I'm just talking again of the South Carolina headquartered banks. They'll start with those 4,000 applications in hand and continue to accept applications too. And I should say, I talk to a lot of our bankers every day, and a lot of them are continuing to accept applications, waiting for the funding.
Let me ask this follow-up question, because I get this question a lot from people. Individuals who say they have submitted information to the lending institution, and the lending institution then passed along the information to the SBA, and at that point in time, the applicants don't know what the status is. What is the best way for an applicant to know whether or not what they have submitted has been submitted by the lender to the SBA, reviewed by the SBA, and approved, and is thereby awaiting to be funded? I mean, how can an applicant find out where continuum, where in that process their application is?
They should contact the bank that they submitted that application to. The bank would have, and I should have said this earlier, the banks will be closing these loans within 10 days of receiving notice of approval from SBA. So a lot of these loans are being closed. A lot of them have already been closed. But the bank should have, and I would think they did in every case, contact the customer to say, okay, your loan was approved by the SBA. Let's go ahead and schedule a time to close. if someone has not heard anything, then certainly they should call their bank.
Let me ask this question in terms of, and we may not know the answer to this because we don't know what sort of supplementary funding Congress might apply for the PPP program. Roughly, do you have any idea what percentage of applicants got funded and what percentage of applicants are still, somewhere in the process waiting to be funded? Do we have any idea of what that percentage is?
Senator, I can go back to the numbers that we have in South Carolina because I pay more attention to those, but 23,000 were approved, and they're within the community banks, 4,000 that were left unapproved at the time the funds ran out. If I were to try to guess what that 4,000 would increase to if we added the out-of-state headquartered banks that have a significant presence, I still think it would be less than the 23,000. So conservative, let's just say 50-50.
Okay, Neil, do you have anything to add to that in regard to that particular question?
No, sir. That's very accurate statement of what we're seeing out there.
Okay. Dr. Gilbert?
No,
What in terms of what's happening up in Congress right now, and I guess nobody really understands or knows, but as we sit here right now, Tuesday afternoon around 2:30, what are the prospects and if something was approved, what would be the timeline for funds being made available and applications being picked up again? Do you have any sense of that? I guess I'll start with Mr. Corp.
That's a whole process to go through. I would say a few days. I would hope, but I feel like I'm guessing at that because that whole process takes a little bit of time.
Okay, and so
Senator,
go ahead.
Senator, I could jump in. I could jump in and add a little more. So I think Congress was scheduled to come back today at 2 p.m. and presumably they would pass this next round of funding, and in the next round of funding is $250 billion, similar to the original PPP, and then another $60 billion for kind of a derivative of the PPP. But Senate comes back in today. Let's say they pass it, they send it over to the House. Who knows what Congressman Massey might do? He said he's going to ask, the House to show up in Washington and vote in person. But if he does not, and the House gets it, they could approve it as early as Wednesday. Then, as I understand it, it goes to the Office of Management and Budget. OMB traditionally takes several days, but assuming they can get it done in a day, it would be available to the SBA maybe as early as Thursday.
And let me kind of repeat something that I think I said earlier. If you're an applicant and you have submitted a PPP application or an EIDL application, there should not be a need to resubmit that application unless Congress changes the criteria for qualification for those particular programs. Is that correct? Am I right in saying that?
Yes, sir. On the PPP program.
How about on the EIDL?
That is absolutely correct on the EIDL. They don't want you to go back and resubmit an application, because even in the EIDL one, they actually had to change that process a couple times. So we get a lot of calls on that. Initially, the applicants had to upload a bunch of documents. They streamlined it to where they got the online application. You just fill in the blanks, hit submit, you get your and you're applying for the EIDL loan with the consideration for the grant up to $10,000. So if you have an application in there, it's already there. Once they get more funding, they'll just keep going.
And let me ask this question, and I know you guys provided some data earlier in regard to the applicants that qualified and how many employees it might have had, and there may have been some skewed information out there about the larger companies getting preference. That aside, is there any discussion right now at the congressional level in regard to this funding for the PPP program? Is there any discussion about making it, say for companies that have 200 employees or less, or 100 employees or less? Or are we still talking about a universe of small business that's defined as less than 500 employees?
Senator, I'll jump in again. As far as I know, we're still talking about 500 and less employees. I'm not aware of, any attempt to lower the number of employees.
Let me ask this. It's a little off topic, but it's a question here. Somebody asked about the employee retention tax credit as an alternative to the PPP program. And maybe Dr. Gilbert, you may be able to talk about this, or anyone. Explain the mechanics of the Employee Retention Credit Act and how that might operate as an alternative to the PPP program.
That's a pretty complicated one that is really outside my area of specialization. So I would have to punt on that one, maybe to Fred or one of the other guys.
Yeah, and any of the others have, and again, it's sort of out of left field, but it was interesting. As an incentive to retain an employee, I would assume you can't take the employee retention tax credit in addition to any sort of PPP loan. And I'm just wondering if there's any worthwhile discussion to be had about the relative merits of those two particular programs.
And Senator, I'm not as familiar with the tax credit, but maybe Mike could weigh in. I was not under the impression that having the tax credit precluded you from applying for PPP. So Mike,
so it's not an either or. Okay, so so I guess that's my question. Then I'll rephrase it. Can you take both, or do you have to make an election between one of the two?
I have not seen anything in writing on that, sir. So I cannot speak to whether you can or not, because that's a good question. I haven't heard that one before out of the hundreds of questions we have had, but I have not seen anything in writing to distinguish between the two.
Okay, the next question goes, it's in regard to a strategy. Is an applicant, who's trying to get a PPP loan, as a matter of strategy, is there advantage to making multiple applications at multiple institutions in the hope that one institution might process your application more quickly than another? Or are you better suited just to stick with one bank and try to go with that multiple approach? And I'll just go ahead and start with Mr. Core and then work our way down to Fred, Neil, and Dr. Gilbert.
You can submit multiple applications, but once the SBA approves one of them, the others will, you won't be able to get more than one, of course. And the system should prevent that from happening.
Okay, so once one lending institution has processed your application and submitted it to the SBA for approval, then as a practical matter, all the other applications will be rendered null, I guess. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. Anything further to add to that, Fred or Neil or Steve?
No, that's the way we understand it as well. And again, it goes back to the approval by the SBA when they assign that particular identifying number back to the bank. That's the key, is it's approved by the SBA, not just submitted.
All right, let me ask this question in regard to the interplay between the payroll protection program and the EIDL program and the enhanced unemployment insurance benefits that the CARES Act provides. And one of the questions here is, if an applicant is making a PPP application to the SBA, does that then preclude their employees from filing for insurance and getting either regular state benefits or the state benefits that are enhanced by the CARES $600 a week supplement? I imagine, can you not do both, or you can do both?
So I can speak to that. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Mike. You go ahead, please.
Okay, I was going to say, no, you can't do both. I mean, basically, when you submit that application, you're going to have your payroll for your employees. And when you go back for the forgiveness part of it, you're going to have to show where you kept those employees on payroll for at least 8 weeks.
Okay, so you'd get the loan, but then if you want to convert that to a forgivable grant, you would have to demonstrate that those funds were actually utilized to pay your employees in order to make that loan forgivable. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. Let me just ask this open-ended question, and I know you guys have been participating in other forums, and as you know, these things change on a daily basis. Starting with Mike or with Mr. Corr, kind of explain to me some of the misconceptions or the information that you think people have found most helpful in conducting these webinars and helping them understand what the CARES Act authorizes, and also helping them understand how they can determine where they are in the process.
Well, I try to, we have a lot of frequently asked questions. So if somebody asks us something, especially if it's by email, I'll try to point them back in the direction, because there's a lot of good information out there. If we get them into the Treasury site or the SBA site. In fact, I have like an email most of the time when I answer somebody. A lot of times if they call, I'll follow up with an email and send them back in that direction. I think most people, honestly, and I'm sure they'd say that on the call too, they're just looking for some answers. And as we said, this has been something that hasn't been done before. So, everybody's asking questions, and we're trying to do the best we can to answer them as we go. And, the EIDL loan, that's where, and I know there's more questions on that. There's a customer service number. But, I think there was one of the questions was really long, and it went through some of the changes that have occurred. And there have been some changes as we go. And we've been just trying to keep people informed of any changes. And overall, the frequently asked questions, that's updated, I would say at least 2 or 3 times a week. So we're trying to get as much information out there.
And I want to ask you about one of those changes in a minute in regard to EIDL, Mike, but can you give that, do you have at your fingertips there a reference to the Treasury site or to the SBA site where those frequently asked questions are answered?
You can just go to treasury.gov. I do have a link, but it's kind of long. Okay. If you go to treasury.gov, it'll have a COVID flag on it, and you click on there, and they've got direct links to most of this information. The SBA, the same thing. If you go COVID support, it'll take you either into the PPP program or the EIDL, so you can get to anything from there. And a lot of times when they call our office, like I said, I'll get them more direct links if they're having trouble finding something too.
Let me ask you about the EIDL. I think there was one program change that's been made after the CARES Act was passed in regard to the $10,000, and I think assigning $1,000 per employee. And so I guess by inference would be you have 10 employees in order to avail yourself of the entire $10,000. What's the status of that, and what's the regulation there?
Yeah, and that was something that changed, because originally the EIDL loan came out, and then when the president signed the authorization, that added the grant portion to it, and that was one of the reasons. Say somebody applied and they uploaded maybe 4 or 5 documents, and then when the grant part of it, the advance up to $10,000 as it was worded initially, when that came up, they asked everybody who had applied before to go back to the site and apply again. So a lot of people feel like they applied twice. The long form uploading documents, and then they went to the shortened version. So right now, I mean, that was probably about a week where people were putting in the long version. Once they converted to the shortened version, they automatically applied for that original EIDL loan, disaster loan, and the advance with it. And as part of that advance, you can get, it's up to $10,000. That was further clarified to state that was $1,000 per employee. And again, we had a lot of calls on that. And I think the goal of that was just to make sure more people could get assistance from that EIDL program.
I've gotten a lot of emails from landlords here, landlords who have larger housing developments, affordable housing developments. Obviously, their cash flow is being pinched as well. Am I right in assuming that right now, since they don't have employees, these landlords, that neither the PPP program or the EID program is going to provide those larger landlords with any financial relief? Is that correct?
That is correct.
And do you know whether or not there's anything contemplated that would provide remuneration to landlords or large scale entities like that, or is that just something that's not likely to be part of any sort of federal relief package?
I have not heard anything more specific on that, sir.
Okay. Let me take a look here. I'm checking off my. All right. In regard to the monies for which the PPP funds have to be used or spent on in order for that loan to become forgivable, I mean, we know that payroll obviously is one of those. What are the other aspects, or what are the other overhead items that applicants can spend the money on, and if they do, have that loan be forgiven and converted into a grant?
So under the PPP, they have to use at least 75% of those dollars has to go directly against payroll to get forgiven. 75%, I think it's meant. And then the other 25% can be used for things like utilities, rent, overhead costs, and so on. So it's basically, it's basically the goal of that, of the whole program, as you'll read on the website, is to keep your employees employed. That's the major goal of that. So that's where the 75% comes into play.
And Mike, and to the extent money wasn't spent for that purpose, say it was spent for some other purpose, would there still be a pro rata forgiveness for the portion of the money that did go to those things, and only the things you spent money on that weren't in those categories would still be allowed, or is it an all or nothing kind of thing?
No, it is prorated. So if you had like 10 employees, and then say if 2 of them, you didn't keep 2 of them, you'd be at 80%. But if you drop below that, then you start getting a prorated forgiveness portion of it, of that loan. And
okay, let me ask this question of Fred and Neil. And this goes back to the initial frustration a lot of applicants had because there was a surge in applications, and obviously banking institutions only have a limited number of personnel. How comfortable do you feel right now that South Carolina banks have the personnel and the ability to respond to what might be a surge of new applicants if there's additional congressional funding? Have there been ramp ups in employments? Have there been independent contractors that can help with SBA qualifications brought on board? What have our state's banks done to ramp up their supply of services to meet the demand of applicants?
So I'm very comfortable that the banks and the folks that work in this program can handle the larger volume. And you have to go back to the day that the first application was made available by the SBA for processing. One bank that I'm aware of, it was the portal was open at 12:01 a.m. and it took until 2 p.m. Friday afternoon before that very first application got through the portal and approved. There was a huge bandwidth issue where it was much higher volume going through the SBA band than the capacity would allow. And so it slowed down the process significantly. Over that first weekend, I think SBA increased the bandwidth. They did a couple of other things. The application flow improved toward the end of the process. Applications, as I understand it, once all the paperwork was received and after keying in the information, it was approved within minutes versus a half day for the first one. Some of the logistical issues are that it's not the bank that is approved to enter the information. It's each individual operator within that bank. Banks have totally reallocated their resources to focus on this, and that's why we were able to get so much done in virtually 10 days. Banks were manning their areas on PPE 24/7 for that 10-day period to include Easter Sunday. And so they understand the process now. As long as that process doesn't change as maybe mandated by Congress or for whatever reason, the flow of applications will go very fast. The concern is it took 10 days to burn up the first 350 billion. I think it'll probably the next 250 billion, which is what is being proposed, will probably go in a matter of 2 to 3 days.
Let me ask this question in regard to, let's assume and let's postulate that there's going to be an additional $250 billion provided. We don't know that yet, but let's say that there is. Will there be any effort or any consideration given by the SBA to approve applications from states in such a way to make sure that it is equitably distributed among states? So in other words, let's say a particular state got a disproportionate amount of the first tranche of funding, either because their applications were processed more quickly or their lenders were more prepared for whatever reason. Is there going to be any effort on that macro level, that SBA level, to make sure that there aren't some areas of the country that are receiving more of this particular PPP stimulus or relief than other areas? Or is that just simply something that's left down to the lending level, and whoever gets approved first and whoever the SBA, funds first, is that going to factor into it at all? And then second to that, how has South Carolina fared so far in regard to, on a per capita or pro rata basis, are we being fairly treated in terms of how those funds have been distributed? And I guess I should direct that question to Mike first, and then we can follow it up all the way down to Fred and then to Neil and to Steve.
That's a really good question. Hopefully I can remember all of that. But no, actually, as you said, there is no rule about equitable distribution. It's kind of first come, first served. The second part of that, with the statistics, we have data on that. I think Fred said there was 23, almost 24,000 loans made, and I think the dollar amount was pushing $4 billion. And, at a macro view, if you just looked at that and looked at comparable size states, I would say maybe Fred could answer this better than I could, but we've done pretty well compared to similar size states from what I could tell just at a glance.
Fred, what you think? Or Neil?
And I agree 100% with Mike. I looked at it various ways, kind of like he did, a list of neighboring states, similar size states, and then really just tried to do a ratio of South Carolina population versus U.S. and South Carolina's allocation, and it says that we've got a fair amount. We were right on target at the 3.8 billion.
But as far as you know, that is not something that when the SBA decides, when applications are processed by banks and submitted to the SBA for approval, that's not factored in by the SBA in deciding whether or not to approve an application, where the location of that applicant is, and how many other loans have been made to the state where that applicant lives. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. A technical question here that somebody is asking. If a new hire is made by an employer after receiving a PPP loan, does the money spent on that new hire, does that count as a payroll expense that will then have that portion of the PPP loan converted to a grant? Or is that PPP loan, does it have to be applied toward the employees that the applicant had at the time the application was made?
No, I think they recognize that there's some, if you took a restaurant, for example, and you're going to lose some employees, the goal is that if you had 30 employees to start with and you want to be forgiven the entire amount, you'd have 30 employees to finish with at the same payroll costs. In other words, you couldn't have 30 employees and you say your payroll is $23,000 and then then you can bring back your payroll again, and 8 weeks later, and it's only 13,000. So it's got to balance out. But they recognize that you may have employee turnover, but you do have to show that that you've kept that payroll at that level for 8 weeks.
Okay, so the payroll level essentially needs to be the same, but the employees, for lack of a better word, are fungible. I mean, not that individuals are fungible, but you have turnover, and as long as you hire somebody else, and that would then count, and you could spend money on them, even though that particular employee wasn't in the applicant's employ when they were first approved. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. All right, I think I've answered pretty much all the questions that have been submitted here thus far. I think I'll close with where I began. And it's really in regard to a matter of communication, in regard to an applicant knowing, okay, here I've filled out my application, I've sent it into the lender, I think the lender has submitted it onto the SBA, I think the SBA is in the process of reviewing my application. I mean, I think the answer was earlier when I asked about how can an applicant check on the status, the answer was they need to talk to the particular lender or the person at that lending institution with whom they dealt. Is that the only way that an applicant has to determine where their application is in the process, or is there some resource online where they can go to see what the status of their application is in the approval process? And I guess I'll start
Senator,
or whoever.
I'll just jump in.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I should have waited. But on the PPP program, it would be directly through the lender. The lender, the SBA is a lender on the other program, and the only way I know that an applicant could determine where their application is to go directly to the bank or lender that they submitted the application to.
Anything to share to that, Neil or Mike or Stephen?
Yes,
that's correct, Senator. That's the way I understand it.
Okay, and I guess, and I heard earlier that there, initially in the process, as we were ramping up quickly, and you had a lot of applications, and there may have been a need to ramp up personnel or reallocate personnel resources at the lending level, or the bank level. You feel at this point in time that should another $250 billion be brought online, that banks are in a better position to take those applications and also to inform applicants on what the status application is over time, and that a lot of the frustration was really the very first few days in the first part of April. Is that correct? Am I in saying that?
Yes, sir. The banks again are very. I should have said this earlier. A lot of the rules were being written as we were going. So applications were coming in, and then the application form changed somewhere along the way. So I had to go back in and get new applications signed. So there's a lot of that that's already behind us. So the bandwidth, as I said earlier, with the SBA has improved. The learning curve that the bankers that have to submit the information, they've come up that learning curve very, very rapidly. And I think now that they can process these applications very quickly. And as I said earlier, my concern or observation maybe is this next round, if it is 250, will go very quickly and go a lot quicker than the first go round.
And let me ask this question, because as you know, for a lot of these small businesses, cash is like oxygen, and they need cash as quickly as possible. Let's assume by some miracle Congress passes this week, and that President Trump signs into law, and $250 billion is put into back the PPP program. Can you give an estimate, given those set of facts, and let's assume that that's done this week? Can you give any estimate to what amount of time there might be between that happening and people who have submitted applications actually getting cash in their hands?
Senator, I would say that if we go through those steps, applications submitted to SBA get a rapid turnaround. The process is almost like an assembly line. So the applicant information goes to another group that starts processing that loan. They call for an appointment. The client comes, in a kiosk, or could even do it electronically and not have to come in the bank and deposit in their account. Some are same day closing, some are a day or two, and on the very far extreme, it's 10 calendar days, not 10 working days. So kind of go from to front end to back end. If it's approved by Congress, applications will be flowing 24/7 again when it opens back up, and checks will be issued, starting on probably Monday, and probably be over by Friday.
Let me ask this question. In regard to applications that have been submitted and passed on by lending institutions to the SBA, I understand the SBA ran out of money and stopped funding. Did they also stop reviewing applications for qualifications, or are they continuing to vet and review those applications and approving them, understanding, however, that they can't fund them or tell lending institutions to fund them until the money is appropriated by Congress? Or has the SBA stopped the process of reviewing the applications itself?
My understanding, go ahead.
On the PPP side, at whatever that time was, 10 a.m. this past Thursday, banks could no longer submit an application to the SBA. So they cut off any submission of application at that point in time and have not opened it back up.
Okay,
that's correct. That's what I was going to say.
Okay, and give me again, wrap up the status of the EIDL. It's my understanding that those are continuing to be funded now, but give me a kind of an idea in regard to the application approval process, the funding process, and what discussions there are in Congress right now for providing new money for the EIDL program. And I guess I'll start with Mike.
Now I did see something where they in that bill there might be $50 billion, I believe, for the EIDL portion of that. And somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure I've seen that. So that's additional funding to what always, whatever was there the first time. So it's kind of the money's going to flow the same way. There's going to be money put into the system, and they're going to keep. Now, again, that process has been kind of slow because they were just overwhelmed with applications. And it's kind of what Fred said with the systems they're using. They had some growing pains, and I think they're just starting to come out of them with how fast they can actually process a loan. And that was some of the questions people asked too, that I think this was in there somewhere, like the processing time and following up. And there's a 1-800 number that applicants can call to check on the status. But I'll just be honest, that has been very slow process in getting information because they're so overwhelmed with applications that they're just now starting to roll out. So, I hope that improves as we go, because all this time in between, whatever money there is to be allocated, whatever's left, it'll be processing out. So hopefully when the new funds come in, it'll just keep flowing.
All right, Dr. Gilbert, I'm going to give you the last word on this. I'm going to ask you to kind of give us a macro perspective on this, and just sort of like, sitting back and looking at, what's happened with the coronavirus, what it's done to our businesses, how Congress has responded, how these programs, either the PPP program or the EIDL program, kind of give me the benefit of your thoughts on that whole system, how you see it working or not working. Because I think people would appreciate your sort of like overall perspective on this. I know that I would.
Well, I think people have to keep pushing. I think that's one of the messages that I've seen with this is that sometimes they got to know at the start, and then they have to ask again. I think we saw that with the unemployment insurance, where I think initially self-employed people had some harder times getting unemployment insurance, but they came back and they asked again. So I think the system is working, but it's kind of being built as we're going. And so folks are going to have to come back and they're going to have to ask questions. They're going to have to follow up with their banks. I think one really important thing for constituents is that they need to go to accurate sources, like have been mentioned today, the Treasury website, an SBA website. I remember when they were debating the bill itself, and my wife and I had conversations about, will this stimulus check have to be repaid? Will it be part of our taxes? What's going to be, how's it going to be handled? And, we could go to members of Congress's Facebook pages and they were not accurate. And it wasn't because they were intentionally being inaccurate. It's simply because it was moving so fast. So folks need to ask more than once. They need to go to authoritative sources and keep going back, because these sites are going to be updated progressively. Another thing that I think is an important consideration, there's, Fred and some of the other guys have talked about how the process should be basically the same this next time around. One of the things that I've heard is that there could be a split where minorities would have a carve out, with rural populations would have a carve out. And so it might be a little bit different. And so the one pot of money that's generally available may get exhausted before those other two pots, if that's how it plays out. And so I guess folks just have to keep trying. It's hard, but we need a certain amount of patience. This is complicated for banks to do right. And whenever you're interacting with a federal program, the feds, they set the rules and you have to follow them. And so, I think the federal government, from my perspective, they've had a robust response. It's been, the scale of it has been immense. But I think there's a lot of help for a lot of folks if they can find their doorway to walk through.
Okay. That reminded me, thank you, Dr. Gilbert, that summary. It reminded me of one last question that I want to ask. And this may be in the form of anecdotal things that I've heard, and it's not true. But what I heard initially is that things weren't getting approved quickly because lenders or banks were afraid that they weren't following all the criteria correctly, and they were afraid that they somehow might be left on the hook, liable for the debt. Has there been any discussion about having a safe harbor or any assurance being provided to lending institutions that if they forget to cross a T or dot an I, there's not going to be some sort of recourse against that institution?
Senator Fred Green again. There's been a lot of discussion on that because, as we've said on the call a number of times through really all of us, this was being built as it goes. The banks could have taken one position and said, we're not going to do anything until, all the rules are written and everything's in black and white, or they could have taken the position that they did, which is one of trust and confidence in our Congress and do what was at a high level the expectation. We chose to take that route. I do hope that that the SBA understands that because it was being written as we go, that there will be different variations. There has been a safe harbor issued by the SBA that basically says if you submitted an application under one set of rules and then those rules changed, you had a safe harbor under the original set. And again, they changed several times along the way. But if everybody doesn't operate under that same spirit and that same thought, about 5,000 banks in the U.S. will be in deep trouble, because that was about how many banks got involved in this and did it under a lot of faith and confidence that it would live up to what was said.
Okay, thank you. I want to go ahead and thank Michael Corr, Fred Green, Neil Rashley, and Dr. Steve Gilbert for participating in this particular webinar. I hope that people found it to be informative in regard to the PPP and the EIDL program. I hope they can take some confidence out of the fact that steep learning curve here. and that lending institutions have ramped up. Hopefully Congress will appropriate the additional $250 billion, and hopefully it'll go smoothly. So with that, I'll bring this webinar to a close. Thank you all for participating. Have a great rest of the week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Senator.
Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you.
Stay healthy.
Thank you.